want to, it's obvious to anybody who's been watching the program this week that our panelists have been from the global north. They have all been folks who are Caucasian, and we haven't had the voices of the indigenous folks. We haven't had the voices of the global south. But when we were convening the panel this week, we identified folks who have been doing a lot of research on the cosmology, on the evolution of the human species, at least from a North American, European-centric perspective. And I just want to acknowledge that has been very much our focus this week. And so there is an obvious missing voice or voices in our conversation. So I want to welcome my co-host, Sean Mitchell, who has been just absolutely critical over the last 3 or 4 months in putting the panel together. And I'll invite Sean to share some opening remarks as we invite Juliet Rody-Brown into our conversation today.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, Jim, Juliet, and welcome everyone. Thanks for saying that, Tom, about, you could say, the lack of a greater element of voices in this particular week. And certainly would like to invite the chat people, if they know of folks that would be good possibilities in the future as panelists from a more global perspective. I think that would be wonderful if they would, bring them to your attention and so forth. I also thought that in our conversation, I just want to be sure that besides the Joseph Campbell hero's journey and Jean's book, The Wizard of Us, that we remember Maureen Murdoch and her book, The Heroine's Journey, and her take on the feminine element, if you will, of the hero's journey. And as we embark, and I think from a Jungian perspective to some degree today, I want to invite Juliet in on the conversation as we, as I say, embark on this adventure into initiation, the belly of the whale, and the trials and tribulations of what occurs on these journeys. Thanks, Tom. Juliet.
Thank you both. Thank all three of you for this introduction. And it's really a pleasure and honor to be here. And I'd like to, so with initiation in mind, along with conscious leadership and holding the focus of the unitive narrative, I thought I would take a moment here for us to just center in and arrive here. Take a breath. Let's all just take a moment and settle in with each other during this time we have together today. Just for a moment here. And breathing into the space we have in this cyber gathering. So with this theme in mind of initiation, I'd like to also start with a poem by, is somebody saying they can't hear me? No, I think I'm good. Okay. Because I have a soft voice sometimes. So, but I'd like to start with a poem, and this is from Sojourner Kincaid Roll. She's a local Santa Barbara poet laureate and activist. She's an extraordinary woman who lives from the heart and who is now, sadly, in hospice care. So this is an honor of her. And I think it also speaks to initiation. It speaks to that belly of the whale. It speaks to how we're standing on this fragile planet. So we can listen to the metaphors as a collective invitation. So here's the poem. It's called Heal. There is that time when the pronouncements of surgeons count not merely as much as a whispering hope, when the fingers wielding scalpel can neither put back nor rejoin. Herein is the real domain of the Creator, the building of the sinew, the melding of synapse. We grasp for life. It is the involuntariness of human outstretched fingers reaching into the abyss, risking failure, knowing it is the welding power of love that must reach into the sinew across the synapse, burning white hot, warming the cool bed. I'll read those last lines again. Knowing it is the welding power of love that must reach into the sinew across the synapses, burning white hot, warming the cool bed. So how do we initiate ourselves in arriving at a place where we can collectively weld the power of love in leadership, in ourselves, as a service mission, as others have talked about the last couple of days, toward a unitive narrative? This is a place where we know that the wounds, through we can say the tilling of the soil, the nurturing, the acceptance and engagement with those wounds, can actually be the seeds, the cultivation for a flowering tree of creative expression, of reciprocal healing. And I remember the late Jean Achterberg, and how she once said something like, the best medicine is when we can blend the shaman and the scientist. And so I think that's what we're up for these days. And we enter the initiatory phase through suffering, through wanting to break the status quo, through these unbearable feelings of, I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this anymore. But how do I do it? How do I do something different? Where do I go? And so that's where the mentor comes in. And that's where I liked what Jude said about every single one of you, every single one of us is a leader in some way, is a mentor in some way, and receives the mentoring in another way. So in Jungian approaches, we look at the symptom, and this can be the symptom of an individual, the symptom of a culture and collective, as guides to be in relationship with. And by being in relationship with these guides, these symptoms, then we're not then projecting them onto others, and we come face to face with the impermanence of things. We find meaning, finally, that invigorates us and can then impact our interactions with others. And I'd like to then talk about...
Juliet?
Yes.
Juliet, we're getting several comments that people can't hear you. Could you talk a little louder?
That's always the case with me. I'm going to put my volume up, and I'm going
There we go.
louder. All right. So, yeah, let me know if my voice goes down again, because that happens. Thank you for pointing that out. I would like to also say that as I'm speaking about collective pieces here, I'm going to be focusing on the image, the symbol of the divine child archetype. So I'll come back to that. But with all this going on in the world, I don't want to keep this also in the abstract. I'd like to try to have some examples. And I would like to have examples of things people are doing, and also some films that exemplify the process. But I also want to say that I have to start with myself. Now, I wake up every morning and I have a tanka of Tara. And Tara has one foot out and one foot in. So let's hold that image for ourselves too, as we talk about this initiatory process, and also the divine child archetype and how it is resonating in our lives. But we have to start with ourselves, right? So I have to ask myself those difficult questions about, how am I complacent in the violence of the world and the violence of the children? I acknowledge my complacency in those moments when I've remained silent, when I could have spoken out on behalf of others, on behalf of myself. I could become more verbally, more physically involved in explicit activism. While I am involved in some, I always have the sense that I may not be rising to my full potential in that area. I'm aware that silence in many cases suggests complicity in the perpetuation of violence. So this is a continuing growing edge for me. And I've engaged in being on the board of restorative justice resources and solidarity and compassion group I've joined, and things like that. Sometimes walking in a march and other things. And I'm a teacher and a psychologist. But we have to start with ourselves, don't we? So I wanted to have you reflecting also, what is resonating for you right now as you tune into a podcast like this? What brings you here to a place like this to ask these questions as well? And I'd like to give you a quote from Jung's Red Book, where he speaks about the spirit of the times versus the spirit of the depths. And ultimately, we want to blend these. But he said that the spirit of the depths even taught me to consider my action and my decision as dependent on dreams. Dreams pave the way for life, and they determine you without you understanding their language. One would like to learn from this language, but who can teach it and learn it? Scholarliness alone is not enough. There is a knowledge of the heart that gives insight. The knowledge of the heart is in no book and is not to be found in the mouth of any teacher, but grows out of you like the green seed from the dark earth. I love that quote. But we can lose touch with this green seed, mostly through the interpersonal wounds that we inflict on each other and on the planet. So initiation often has us seeking to critically question the status quo because we're shaken up. Initiation beckons us to expand our perceptual bandwidth. So was there a time when you, listeners, you felt lost to this sense of connection? Is there a mentor in your life who accompanied you to bravely risk the inner turmoil of coming back home to yourself? Were you tested in this initiation into deeper, more unity consciousness? And how are we being tested collectively? Let's just have you close your eyes for a moment and simply soften your gaze without thinking too much about it. Bring yourself to a moment in childhood where you can recognize now that you were called to a purposeful life and how that showed up for you. Something that led you here, curious to be at a podcast like this. Feel in your body the sensations of that place, the smells, the sounds. And bring yourself to the remembrance. It's often a place in nature, but this is your bring your attention to any wisdom figures, any guides an animal, plant. Feeling how your breath breathes you. And there's often a distinct message in these moments. So allow that inner voice to sit with you for this moment. And stay with that for a moment. You may wish to jot something down that might come up later in discussion. So, okay. Thank you. So, in terms of our, I might share the screen right now. Let me see here. Okay, can you see that? All right, great. So Maria Louise von Franz said that the child is a symbol of inner renewal, and it points to the future. And Jung also proposed that we can see in the symbol of the child that the world itself is speaking. And I wanted to position that the indigenous children will be or are already elders for whom and with whom we can learn if we assist and collaborate with them rather than putting the entire burden of the future on their shoulders. We can hear the divine child's creator spirit and world message of a cosmological way of knowing in the words of Titaucho Muhawit. He's a Chumash elder. And several years ago, I was interested to learn from the local Chumash themselves and those who were willing to speak with me about what it felt like to have some of their practices appropriated. And he had some very generous words to say about people being called to this because they're tapping into their own remembrance. And as long as it's done with that spirit of engagement with those who'd like to share their ways and their stories, then it's a beautiful thing. It's kind of what's needed. We need to be in these participatory frameworks to move forward. He said, what's necessary is to live in harmony with nature. He said, so I talk about nature. I am talking about all peoples. When I talk about people, I'm talking about not just the human race, but the stone people, the winged people, the fish people, everything that exists, alive. Nature is alive. And it's literal children, you know, such as Greta Thunberg, who have invited new ways to be with each other in this world as creators, who invite an alternative path forward. And once given voice, the abandoned child becomes an ever-present archetypal necessity. And as Hillman, James Hillman, the late James Hillman concluded, that if we give voice to that which has been abandoned, we now have not only the child's vulnerability, we also have its evolving futurity in all of us. By giving voice to and assisting others in kind of deconstructing this cultural history that has dominated, we liberate ourselves and others from trauma, from oppressive conditions that brought us to this present condition. So spiritual needs, soul wounds are attended to. Some examples are, let me just jump forward. And also there's some parallels between James Hillman's idea of the perennial child, Jung's notion of the archetype as primordial. We see child archetypes not as a representation, archetypes not as a representation, but as something emergent in the subtle system. And we could say that they offer potential. So paying attention to the images that come up for us, like we did in this exercise just now, coming back to ourselves, what were those callings that we come to when we then enter the initiation phase, because we're sort of called back. And this is how we can also acknowledge the historical wounds without denial. I like Singer and Kimball's, who've done some work around the multicultural imagination and cultural complexes. And here's a couple quotes from them. Based on repetitive historical group experiences which have taken root in the cultural unconscious of the group complexes are everywhere, and one can easily feel swamped by their affects and claims. Mostly, these group complexes have to do with trauma, discrimination, feelings of oppression and inferiority at the hands of another offending group. Group complexes litter the psychic landscape and are easily detonated as the literal landmines that scatter the globe and threaten life, especially young life, everywhere. And that's de Taucho's words again. And the voices that have come out among men. Another image that struck me, there's a sculpture of a Bahamian girl, and it's beautiful. It's under the water in Bahama, and she's 17 feet, I think, and she's got her shoulder almost like Atlas holding up the world, but she's under the water, and the water is here. And she's this image of this young female Bahamian girl. And it's just a beautiful image if you look that up on the internet. So I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to give some examples of being on the ground, as it were, and bringing that archetypal child presence into actual work. So Nuria Siafalo is a researcher who spent some time in the Lakandan rainforest and put together a book called Indigenous Psychologies. And in that book, there are chapters written by the children, the youth themselves, talking about what works, what they hope for. She would sit for many days and hours with the people from all generations, talking about what it felt like, what was happening in their worlds that felt oppressive, and what was opening them for more exploration, more healing. And it was often through the arts, as we know in Jungian work, that's a way that we can work with metaphor. We can let things in that may not have been able to be there otherwise because it's too threatening. Anyway, I thought that was really wonderful that she did that. And then the story of a student who was going into the Guadalupe with the farm workers and trying to offer psychotherapy. And he was a bilingual student himself, and he needed practicum hours. And when he found out that there was this community in Guadalupe we found a supervisor for him in an organization that allowed him to go in and do some therapy groups. They were saying that they needed that. The organization was saying that the people needed that. Well, so he came in and he started doing these therapy groups in the typical way that he was doing them in Los Angeles in a local clinic, and it wasn't working. It wasn't working. It didn't feel right. And suddenly something struck him. His grandmother had passed away a few months ago, and she was a curandera in Mexico. And he took a breath and he just started telling some stories and inviting those stories from his own indigenous past. And it opened something in the groups, that it opened their hearts, it opened their capacity to trust that they could bring those older stories mixed in with their Catholicism, because a lot of them were Catholic, and it was okay. And that it was also okay to trust the therapeutic processes. But the trust was opened by being present to the moment, by listening, by not imposing a sort of colonized worldview on others. And he learned and grew from it as well, and went back to Mexico and did some more work in the community that his grandmother was from. So those are a couple of examples. And then Corcoran Prison did some workshops with restorative justice, and one of the women who went with us, her brother had been in a gang and killed, and she spoke about the ripple effects in her whole family, and but not in a blaming way. And we opened them. We did some guided visualizations that spoke about trauma and what it does, how we go offline and dissociate, and just met them where they were. They'd already been through the alternatives to violence programs, so they were ready for this. And but afterwards, a man came up and said, "Thank you for making me human again." It's really, really moving.
Juliet, it's Sean. Could you maybe take down your screen share so we can see you better?
Yes, I'll go ahead and do that. Let me do that now. Sure. Yeah, so I bring those examples up to kind of bring us down to the ground with these concepts we're talking about in the hero's journey, the heroine's journey. I'm glad you brought up Maureen Murdoch, because I think it was in the 90s that she came out with the book, The Heroine's Journey. But I also came across a piece about gender transition as a hero's journey, and the non-binary language we can use. We can use the hero, as we say, actor or sculptor or anything, that we were trying to depolarize some of these, even in our language. But I found that fascinating as well. I like that this quote from Jung: "The child is begotten out of the depths of human nature, or rather out of living nature herself. It is a personification of vital forces quite outside the limited range of conscious mind, of ways and possibilities of which our one-sided conscious mind knows nothing. A wholesomeness which embraces the very depth of nature." So these this child can be a guide then. The child is a subtle emergent process within all of us that impacts the actual children in our world. And it's that transcendent function that helps us through the initiation. A couple of films that stand out for me, and always have since I saw them initially, they just hit me in my gut, were Pan's Labyrinth and Precious, and also Whale Rider. And each of those films has a female protagonist who is struggling against oppressive systems in both systemic and family contexts. And that individual in each of those films, if we look at that as our world psyche, and if we look at, you know, all of these elements of the film as these different parts of what we're dealing with, I think they're really great films to show this hero-heroine initiatory process. So maybe I can, you know, amplify a little bit. So we talk about these different parts in the journey of the hero process. And so there's the departure and the initiation, the return, the move from the world that we could say is ordinary, but it's not so ordinary in a lot of ways because it's often full of trauma. But then moving to a different world, jumping off. And this is where that dark night of the soul, the belly of the whale, the unknown is faced, and the struggle to discover oneself, to discover that inner light and come back home, but in a different way. So then returning to the world, but a changed person, a changed collective, we can say, a new perspective, new skills, new ways of being with each other that often involve the capacity to love, the capacity to have self-compassion, compassion for another. So in Precious, I don't know how many of you have seen that film, but I don't know in the chat if people can say they've seen that or not. But she's leaving a very oppressive environment where she's being abused, sexually abused, incest, and doesn't have anywhere to turn but to the fantasy world. So she escapes into a fantasy world where she's adored, she's a celebrity in that world. She's, you know, she's just gone completely numb to the outside world. And she sits in class and she's just, you know, not there. You know, the only place that's alive for her is in this imaginary world where she can be anything she wants. Yeah, thank you, Cindy, for putting that trailer up. And maybe we can, you know, I would offer maybe to even watch that trailer, but let's just stay with talking for now instead of all the technological stuff to deal with. But what she does is something within her does listen to a teacher. She goes to an alternative school and she's pregnant and she is pushed out of the one school because she's pregnant. She goes to an alternative school and there's a teacher. There's a teacher who sees her. There's a teacher who invites her to something different. So this is a mentor. This is a mentor that brings her into a different world. And at first, she doesn't trust it, of course. Who would? If you're Donald Kalch's work around the inner world of trauma talks about how these imaginary pieces will come in fantasy to protect us. Initially, they're there to protect us. And they can be angelic or monstrous images in those places. But they're there as an escape from the human world, because the human world is just too dangerous, just too dangerous. But in Precious, she then has other allies that come around, the social worker, the nurse while she's giving birth at the hospital. And now that image of the divine child is born, and now there's a possibility for a different life, a different way of being for Precious and for this new child that's out of the oppressive system of the family, still in a larger oppressive system perhaps, but with allies that help through that belly of the whale, so that there's possibility for a different way. It's been held in love. It's been held in a compassionate witnessing, compassionate companionship. And in Pan's Labyrinth, that film is interesting because Guillermo del Toro himself said that it was through monstrous images in his own childhood that, let me see if I can find his quote. I don't know, but it's monstrous images in his own childhood that brought him out. So I often wonder, when I saw that film, I wondered what was going on in his own life that he brought forth a film like this. You know, it's fascinating to see how art and life, you know, interact with each other. But that film is, she's in an oppressive system. Her father has died, the protagonist, the young girl protagonist, Ophelia. And her mother marries a fascist, you know, in the military, who's very, very cruel, and she goes through initiation process in the world tree, which is very scary. A lot of people don't want to look at that film because they say it's really disturbing, but I think it's an important film for us to look at in terms of our collective. And I think it's time maybe for Jim to say something, because I've been speaking for quite a while. And maybe as we get into discussion, I can touch upon. And I also have a poem to share that a student gave me. It's called Threshold, and I thought it would be great to share that at some point. But I've been speaking for a while. There's a lot more to share, but let's share it collectively here in our group. So Jim, I'm going to turn it to you now.
Thank you, Juliet, for your remarks. It's always good to immerse oneself in Jungian archetypal psychology and mythology, and particularly as it gets refracted through film and movies, because that's such a universally appreciated art form. So thank you for your remarks. I would approach, I think, the issue of conscious leadership from a very specific vector. As I've been thinking about it, I would say that context shapes content, something that I have emphasized many times on Humanity Rising, that the content of what we feel about love or courage or hate or fear, nobility, sadness, leadership, is always framed within a certain context. And the context is very important to understand, because, as they say, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up somewhere else. And so for me, if I had to give one word for the context for conscious leadership in our world today, it would be apocalypse. And I think that's very important for us to bear in mind. And, you know, it was the Buddha 2,500 years ago that made that point in a different way, in a different context. But he said to those who wanted to talk about eternity and the omnipresent reality of truth, he says, that's not the way you approach truth. The reality is that we're in a burning house. And unless and until you understand that the house is burning, you don't know what to do to put the fire out. Because first you have to put the fire out. So for me, the starting point of any conversation about leadership is an awareness that the entire human enterprise is past the brink of extinction. Virtually every scientist in the world that considers matters pertaining just to the issue of climate change says that the human race, the species Homo sapiens, is one of a million other species now on the brink of extinction. And there's a growing number of scientists and commentators who believe that we're past saving and that there's actually nothing that we can do. And I would reference here the comment of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in his speech to the General Assembly in the third week of September, just over 6 weeks ago, where he said, several years ago, I warned that we were now in code red. And he says, now we're past code red. Humanity has now opened up the gates of hell. And I think if you look around the world, there's no other way, if you're trying to be objective, to describe the reality in which we find ourselves. So that's my starting point. Now, if that's your starting point, then it seems to me that there's a couple of implications to this that, in my view, inform leadership, particularly leadership that seeks to be conscious. And the first is that we're called upon in this time to address the fire. I think that leadership that's not addressing the apocalypse is delusional. And I would reference Prigogine here, where he says from his studies of chaos theory that coherence never occurs in the absence of chaos. And in fact, it is the capacity of conscious beings to trim tab off of the chaos around them that gives them the energy, literally, to create the coherence. So I would say that for me, conscious leadership is derivative on the and from and off the chaos that is escalating all around us. So, for example, I would take a stand that people who go off into the monastery, into the forest, and just sit and have nothing to do with the world, I would say that that's not appropriate in a time of apocalypse, that we're in a situation globally, every country, every society, where if we're not part of the solution actively, we're part of the problem. And the single lack, if you think about it, in our world right now is that people of goodwill are not sufficiently on the front lines. If all the people who care deeply about evolutionary consciousness and evolutionary development of humankind were on the front lines putting out the fire, that would indicate to me that we would have reached a critical mass, which takes me to my second point, which is, I think, even more important than trying to be consciously aware of the fire and directing one's attention to the fire, and that is radical collaboration. As I think Mary Thorpe said in the chat a few minutes ago, which I really appreciated, Mary, that when she hears about the hero and heroine's journey, she said it kind of makes her skin crawl, because it feels like it's a mythology that isn't appropriate for our time, and that she's perfectly content for the human journey. And I think I would underscore Mary's insight that we're no longer in a time of the hero or the heroine. We're in a time where humanity as a collective, the progressive movement as a community, as a collective, needs to come together. And as someone who's been working in the movement virtually all of my adult life, since the Vietnam War in the late 60s, I can say that not once in my lifetime has the movement come together. So it's not enough to work on the problem, in my view. I think that's only one aspect of leadership. It's also necessary, and I would say an urgent imperative under current world conditions, to work in a spirit of radical collaboration. And any of you out there that have tried to do it know how difficult it is. It's the bane of the left. It's the bane of the people of goodwill, that the extraordinary paradox of people who want noble destiny for humankind is the inability to work together harmoniously. You know, they say that a firing squad among progressives is formed in a circle. And I think that's fundamentally true. And that's a goal that I think remains elusive. And because it remains elusive, the activities on the part of the individuals or the individual organizations working for a noble goal, but working competitively against other progressive groups, is the reason why we're failing, and that the world situation is continuing to spin out of control, which would just lead me very quickly so we can have a dialogue on this. Looking forward to final comment. And that is that I think that there's an illusion that many people in the progressive movement have about the fact that the change of consciousness needs to be on the other side. That somehow, if we could get the fascists or the right wing or the authoritarian dictators, etc., to somehow change consciousness, that would open up the pathway to the solutions that we seek. But more and more, I have to say that I'm coming to the conclusion that the greatest lack of conscious leadership is not with them, it's with us. And, you know, the definition of insanity is thinking that you can do the same thing over and over and get a different outcome. Well, I don't think you can. And I think, therefore, what I wrestle with day by day is how I can exercise leadership in a spirit of radical collaboration, which is what we're seeking to do so far unsuccessfully on Humanity Rising. Nobody's been able to pull it off. Nobody. And realizing that as we read the news about what the bad guys are doing, in my case, working on the UAP issue, the unidentified anomalous phenomena, is trying to come into a comportment of attitude that, as Ken Wilber said, nobody's completely right and nobody's completely wrong. And so how do you have a posture of compassion for the range of attitudes, perspectives, and behaviors that we bear witness to in the world day by day, and have the greatest compassion for my own inability to take and exercise the kind of leadership that would actually make a difference in a world with a diminishing time frame to do so before we, along with other species, go extinct. And so those would be some of the conundrums that I would offer about leadership, because I think history has taken us way beyond platitudes. And only if we grapple seriously with the issues of our time in very, very concrete ways will we be able to save ourselves and ensure humanity's durability unto the children of the seventh generation. So that's where I think Tom and Sean, Juliet, I would come out on this issue of conscious leadership. My observation is that there's precious little of it in the world, because we're still in modalities that have been made anachronistic by events. And it's our lack of appreciation of that that constitutes the major part of our predicament.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Juliet. What a wonderful kickoff to our dialogue today. I so appreciate both of your perspectives and comments, and the richness of thought and care that you brought into our dialogue. And I'm also reflecting on some of the comments that were made earlier in the week. I can't help but recall what Richard Olivier shared with us about the caterpillar in the stages as it's devouring the imaginal cells that's going to evolve into the butterfly. And we certainly are seeing that in humanity, where we are electing leaders, we're doing things that are against our self-interest in terms of the evolution of the caterpillar to the butterfly. And we have lots of examples you both have pointed to, and we can look around us and see that happening, that lack of conscious leadership in destroying our very planet and each other. I'm also drawn to a comment that Dr. Zach Bush made in a program I hosted back in January, where Zach talked about that we're in the sixth mass extinction. And if we look at the previous 5 mass extinctions on planet Earth, the species that have evolved from that extinction have been at a higher consciousness. And he shared that perhaps that's the role of the human species, is to liberate all the carbon in the Earth out into the atmosphere, so that when the sixth mass extinction happens, that carbon is available for the next species. And so, at least on a cosmological level, then perhaps that's what we're doing, and we've done it very successfully. But my hope is that we can delay that evolutionary process, and that there is an opportunity for us to recognize our higher angels. And so, Sean, what's alive for you in this moment?
Gosh, my hair's blowing back with a few things, and I'm going to comment a little bit on what you just said, Tom. Thank you, and Jim and Juliet. I'm not particularly an alarmist, and so as we know that our planet had, boundaries have changed, empires have come and gone, species have come and gone. If we're in a state of demise, then we're in a state of demise. I'm less alarmist, but I want to put that in what Jim said earlier about content and context, because this is coming from Sean, and Sean's, unique, this is my time on this planet, in this vessel, this incarnation, if we believe that, my upbringing, et cetera, et cetera. This is, I believe, is universal wisdoms or divine consciousness or God or spirit or whatever, wants to express through this vessel at this time today. And Sean's not particularly, like I said, an alarmist. And she kind of moves into where she's comfortable. And this can be probably maybe even a default, not so great place, where she takes on sort of the Eckhart Tolle being a vessel of presence, at least wanting to be a vessel of presence, a vessel of peace, a vessel where someone feels safe to speak with me, and so on. As I am not as able to, I'm not Jim, who's got this extraordinary capacity for sharing with us, how alarming and chaotic our world is right now. So maybe in terms of where can Sean help the chaos is where can those of us who are don't have those capacities and qualities of being like a more assertive leader, is more of maybe that, can hold the space, can hold a different frequency of presence. And then one last thing I thought about when you were talking about radical collaboration, Jim. Oh my gosh, yes. And Kat said something just as I was thinking about silos. This is a challenge. This is really a big challenge, I feel, too, because, and I don't want to say, it's a masculine or feminine thing, but the egos seem to be involved. And this is across all spectrums in governments and community governing, where, my where I work in the city or the city council, don't touch my scenario here. I got it. It's just everywhere across the board. And yeah, that's an invitation on how we can radically collaborate. And wish I had an answer for that, but those are just some of my thoughts.
Well,
So
thank you for that. I think that, excuse me, Tom.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I thank you for recognizing that, Sean. And I certainly want to appreciate and respect that all of us have different approaches to what's going on. But I would say that just to take an example of what's happening right now with what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, we're witnessing genocide. We're witnessing a strategic policy formation to eliminate the Palestinian people from Gaza. And it seems to me that it's not of utility to be neutral, that we need to realize that occasionally in life, it's important. Let's say the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 60s with Martin Luther King. Some people did stay on the sideline. But I wonder how history will judge that. Some went into the fray and got killed, as we know from the narratives that were laid to us. So there's a cost in being part of the solution, but there's also a cost in being part of the problem. And I think that one of the characteristics of our world, given the omnipresence of the accelerating chaos, is that there's less and less neutral ground. I guess that's the point that I'm wanting to make. So, for example, on climate change, every choice that we make about what we buy, what we eat, whether we recycle, or whether we don't, all of that contributes like a pebble dropped in a pond, so that even though some people want to stay away and not do something, that has an effect in a time of apocalypse, because we're no longer in a normal situation, like say what 150, 200 years ago, where the climate was normal and everybody could go upon the earth with a certain largesse, unaware, because they didn't need to be, of some of the dangers that are now challenging humanity in an unprecedented way. So I think that's the point that I would make, is that each and every one of us are called upon to be aware of the context, and then given our personalities, to do whatever it is that we're called upon to do, which will be very, very different. But be aware that all of our choices now actually matter in an empirical way.
Thank you, Jim. I really want to just contribute to what you just said, because what comes up for me is the notion of being and doing, right? And I should be speaking from the I, but is Sean doing from a particular place of being? And can that element of being potentially be, have the capacity to suspend when she's triggered? I'm going to rip somebody's face off today. And, can I suspend that emotion for a moment or two? But in a bigger context of what you're talking about, I would really love to encourage one to kind of look at their state of being in terms of their doing. And in my case, no question, have I defaulted into a comfortable place of doing, maybe because I don't feel as confident, or I don't feel as educated, or I don't feel as charismatic, and so forth. And so all my self-judgment comes up. You're going to look like an idiot. You're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to embarrass your family, but I'm going off on a tangent. But I really want to come back to what you're saying in terms of the being and the doing together.
Juliet,
Can we invite you into the conversation? You'll need to take your device off mute.
Yes, thank you. I so appreciate this discussion, and Jim, your passion and all that you've done in the world and continue to do as an active force, and Sean, bringing up the different ways that we approach things based on who we are and what our context is. And Tom, I appreciate your comments too. One thing that strikes me is, in terms of the fascists and othering that kind of thing, is that we all have the fascists within us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the important piece here, is to recognize that we have all of it within us. We are the oppressors. We are the killers. We are the wounded. And when one of us suffers, all of us suffers. And it sounds abstract to just say that, but to feel that, I can't help but believe that by feeling that and doing practices that can impact the energetic field, if you will, that some people are stronger in doing that than putting themselves out there physically. And I struggle with that myself. Where is that? Where do I draw the line? I have participated in marches. I joined boards. I hold space. in a listening, kind of comforting way for people, while I like to invite all voices to be present, as difficult and traumatic sounding and triggering as they may be. And I think that might be one of my strengths for being present, being able to listen to different sides of stories and not jumping in to make somebody wrong. But I'm also always trying to look at myself. Where am I the oppressor? Where am I the facilitator? You know, where am I disappearing? Where am I dissociating? Where am I just wanting to disappear? Where am I wanting to avoid? All of those things. Where am I the fascist? You know, how am I in touch with that? How am I in relationship with that? Starting with myself. But yeah, getting out there and being a force and having all of the information and the historical contexts around the world and being able to speak those off the cuff. I don't have that. So I do my little bit as I can and try to walk my talk. And I think that's the best I can do, but I keep trying to, move in a different place from recognizing the chaos we're all in, and we are.
Well, I would agree with what you're saying, and I would underscore that each personality, each person has a different way of presencing themselves in the world. And I think the great example that I would offer is Thich Nhat Hanh. You know, at the time of the U.S. Incursion into Vietnam in the 60s, most of the Buddhists were in the monastery and felt that they could stay in the monasteries even though the war was raging. And it was Thich Nhat Hanh that said, no, we keep meditating, but we meditate with the intention toward peace. And if you remember, at the time, that was an extraordinarily controversial and provocative thing to say, that Buddhist monks who were supposed to be in the monastery were out on the streets, sitting themselves down in the middle of the protests and still meditating. They were in full lotus position, holding center. So that's an example, Sean, of what you're saying of being and doing in a time of apocalypse have to be brought together. And if they're brought together, then whatever is done has an impact toward not only solving the issue, but also refining the being who's doing the meditation in that case for a political end. So that's why, for me, context is so essential in understanding content, because it's situational ethics, if you want to call it that. That it's understanding where we are that enables us to more deeply understand who we need to be in this situation. And once we know that, then what will be called up from the depths of our psyche, and you're absolutely right, Juliet, we are everything. I mean, never forget Dante's great line in the Divine Comedy. He never heard of a crime that in his heart he knew he couldn't commit. That's how true what you're saying really is. But then what determines then, as I understand it in my experience, what determines what emerges from one's depths is the acuity with which being and doing are brought together in a noble purpose.
Beautiful. Yes.
I'd love to piggyback on what you just said, Jim, if you don't mind. For me, it boils down to conscious leadership with a spiritual ethic. And that has to do with the being when you said, who do we need to be in our doing? And I believe, a personal belief, that the divine expression wants to express through each of us. And allowing that, having an alignment with that, and a trying to have an alignment with that, a present recognition of that attempt of God's source, universal wisdom, like I said, wanting to be an expression through us, then that's, I believe, who Sean needs to be.
Mm.
And I, of course, invite that for everybody else, everyone else too. And that then would reflect, I feel, in a what I call a spiritual ethic and a spiritual element to conscious leadership, even if we're just leading our own lives.
Mm-hmm. But
definitely in terms of what you're talking about and stepping out in the doing of something that is so authentic, so heartfelt, so real. And you walk the talk, Jim. You truly do. And I believe Juliet and Tom do as well. And probably most everybody on the call.
Of course.
And how can we support each other? Maybe that's part of those silos too.
Yeah, a question that's rising for me. So the invitation has been extended, whether it's the climate change or other global forces that are forcing us. So the invitation has been extended. There are lots of people around the planet that are resisting the invitation, they're not realizing they don't have a choice in the matter. And so we're all being initiated. So I would just invite each of you to share, what are we being initiated into? And we've talked about it, but just maybe to ground that a bit more, to pull out your crystal ball and to share what is humanity? What are each of us individually being initiated into?
Juliet?
For me, it might just be the assertiveness of putting my body out there, my being that I, hold more quietly, perhaps putting out there more actively, more assertively. An example recently, some students, or I probably shouldn't share this because it would be confidential, but let me put it this way. If one voice is invited and one voice asks to speak, then all voices have to be explicitly invited, because if they're not, they don't feel welcome. And then that's where the conflict starts, and the us and them, and the miscommunications, the misunderstandings, and the divides get deeper. And so the learnings about being explicit, being assertive, putting my body, myself out there to walk my talk, make a difference in the world, and articulate that somehow. And I think that that's been a growing edge for me, and will continue to be a growing edge for me, having been a very introverted person in my life. And so I really appreciate this discussion, Jim, about stepping out. We're in the fire, and we can let ourselves, and I can let myself be burnt by the fire. I can stand there, stay there and let myself be burned. Or I can be part of the fire, not look at it as something different that burns me, but that I am the fire. And that if I am the fire, we are all the fire. And how are we going to be in this fire together? I don't know. All I know is that I think I do know a growing edge for me is is the stepping more.
Mm. Yeah, beautifully put. Yeah, that's a deep question, Tom. You know, what is the rite of passage that humanity is kicking and screaming, being forced through? It reminds me of that great line from Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, that drop by drop, pain that cannot forget falls upon the heart, until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom from the holy grace of God. And I think humanity is in that moment where the accumulated drops of pain and trauma and hurt and suffering have reached such a qualitative state that we are drowning in our own trauma. And out of that is coming, in a way that we can't understand, the awful grace of God. And for me, as I'm seeking to understand it, I think the rite of passage has a lot to do with humanity coming into an awareness that the moment of cosmic contact is upon us. And I'd like to just share that for a moment, because I think what humanity needs and what we desperately lack is a globally acceptable narrative that can unite us as one. And the reason why I'm in Washington is because what the US government is now doing is beginning a 7-year process of releasing information into the global public to that end, that we are not alone, that extraterrestrials have been here on planet Earth for some time. There's evidence to that effect that is going to be coming out one way or another. And so this is affording humanity a whole new opportunity to embrace what I believe is the greatest initiation in our collective species history. And that is to come alive globally, instantaneously, that humanity has a role to play, a destiny to fulfill, of which it's never been aware. And if you think about the reality of the extraterrestrial moment that we are now entering, for the first time, I've become aware of why it is that humanity was even created. Why were we created by Mother Earth with such versatility and adaptability and power and imagination, such that we have now, within the last generation, actually began to leave the planet? Well, if you think about it, Earth created humanity to be our conscious ambassadors to the rest of the cosmos. It needed a species like us to be able to interact with the extraterrestrials at the level of cosmic unity. And so for me, as I've been here in Washington working on the passage of the final bit of legislation making all this possible, my soul has been filled with this sense that we're undergoing a great initiation into the next phase of what and who humanity needs to be to fulfill the purpose for which we were created. And what that means, at a minimum, as the extraterrestrials have been saying to people all over the world, is we have to stop killing each other. And we have to stop destroying the planet. And in particular, we've got to stop our nuclear weapons. Because if we use the nuclear weapons, not only will we wipe ourselves out, but we will set back planetary evolution by thousands, if not millions of years. So we need to come into terms that there is, in fact, a great initiation taking place. But it's not just human qua human. It's not even human qua Earth. It's human in symbiotic relationship with the Earth, so we can move beyond the Earth and embrace the next phase of Earth evolution as Earth ambassadors to the larger galactic civilizations that have been visiting us for some time and giving us guidance for what is required for the kind of transformation and an initiatory process that is required for the next level of refinement of consciousness and service to the larger Earth consciousness, which is part of the overall galactic civilizations of which we are discovering we're a very small little part. So for me, it's a very exciting initiatory process from a Jungian point of view, initiated by the very government that's doing the most damage. And that's, to me, the beauty of how drop by drop, pain that cannot forget falls upon the heart until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom by the awful grace of God.
How about for you, Sean? What are we being initiated into?
I'm not sure I can, yeah. I think that this is a good closing right here. There's nothing more I could say, because I agree. I would have said something along the lines is, for me, the initiation is surrendering to what's going to happen that is far cooler than Sean could come up with.
Exactly. This is humanity now, folks. This is humanity.
Thank you both, Juliet and Jim, for being with us today. And thank you, Sean, for helping to put this extraordinary week together. It's been such a fun experience, exploring things that, at our foundation as a species, we need to be exploring. And I think for me, when I think about the question, what are we being initiated into? We're being initiated into the opportunity to move from dualistic thinking to non-dualistic thinking. Whether it's what we're seeing with the evolution of gender identity, that's forcing us to accept a non-binary way of seeing the world, the UAP initiative, where we're being forced to see that it isn't a dualistic way of being. There's so many opportunities, if we just open our eyes and look around, that we live in a non-dualistic consciousness. And I think that's part of what we're being initiated into, against our will, against our stubbornness, against our way of experiencing reality. And it's a huge gift, but with any human journey, hero, heroine, or otherwise, there's the dark night of the soul, and that's very much where we are. So as we wrap up, just any closing comments from each of you? Jim?
I think I've probably said enough. I'll just express my gratitude to Juliet and Sean and yourself for convening these kinds of quality discussions on Humanity Rising, because these are the conversations that matter. And then how we transform them into actions that make a difference is really the dance. It's really the initiation. it's really the magic and the miracle of what it means to be human at this time. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Juliet.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here and to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Sean, for inviting me, Tom, for being part of the planning of this, Jim, for being here and for all that you do and starting this whole ubiquity and humanity rising conversation to begin with. And it's an honor to be here. That's the closing words. A student who's in dissertation phase wrote a poem, Threshold. If I can just I won't read the whole thing because of time, but allow for the dying of a season that has passed. This is the parting of the seasons. You are now crossing a threshold. And that's from Eduardo Viesca. So I'll close with that.
Sean?
Just a brief thank you to everyone. There's gardening noise in the background, so I'll put myself back on mute and just thank you, everyone. Juliet, Jim, Tom, and all the folks that make this happen in the background. Much appreciated.
So I'll just share a couple of comments about tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be joined by three wonderful panelists where we'll be talking about the return and what is the wisdom that we have harvested from the initiation and the dark night of the soul. And it will be another rich, I can assure you, another rich and very fulfilling conversation and dialogue. So thank you all for being with us today, and look forward to being back with you tomorrow.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sean, Juliet. This has been an amazing conversation today. That'll bring us to a close. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You also received it in your Zoom reminder for the session today. And we'll see you tomorrow for our next chapter of conscious leadership. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Day 800.
That's day 800 tomorrow. So it'll be a special day.